Good evening and welcome to The Velocity of Now with me, your host Thomas Sheridan, here on the Reality Bytes Radio.com network. It's June 24th, 2015, and I hope you're all keeping well. We passed through an interesting phase this year. We've just come through the solstice, and I'll be talking about that and what's happened on the other side of that solstice. And we've also had some interesting Aurora Borealis lately, some spectacular shows that a large flare from the sun has not only brought beautiful weather to this part of the world at last, but also some pretty remarkable electrical storms over the North Pole. Now, one thing I noticed last night, there was an aurora last night and I caught the tail end of it, and then it clouded up after a while, but I saw a phenomenon which I'd never noticed before, and if any of you have ever heard of this, maybe you could dig some information up, or you know something or you heard something before. I've looked online and there's no mention of it. I have a large cluster of wild oxeye daisies in my front yard. Now they're wild species that I got off the mountains, and I just spread the seed, and they seed themselves every year, and they grow quite tall, and the flower is quite wide. It's about 3 inches wide, 6 or so centimeters. And they're a beautiful flower, and they always face towards the south because the front of my house faces north. So it's lovely when you walk out of the house, they're all staring at you, these lovely daisies. Now, last night after the aurora, I'm not kidding you, they had developed a bioluminescence. The daisies were glowing in the dark. Faintly, but glowing. I've never seen this before, and I'm wondering if the actual effects of the flare has caused them to glow, or if there are species of bioluminescent oxeye daisies that I don't know about. But I can tell you for a fact, I'd never noticed this before, but last night the daisies were glowing, as clear as anything. They were projecting light. So that may just be an interesting phenomenon that's associated with the aurora, but nonetheless it blew my mind. And if you ever heard anything about this, well, you can let me know about it. Now, it's as I said, it's the 24th of June 2015. My website is thomassheridanarts.com, and we will be continuing this look into the roots, this concept of bringing back the snakes. And tonight I want to talk about Druidism as in general. Now, a couple of weeks ago I did a special on Merlin, which got great feedback, and one of the aspects we spoke about was the possibility that Merlin, the wizard, did not convert to Christianity, hence why he was the son of a devil and a servant of God. Now, we know for a fact the Druids and King Lyra, after St. Patrick burned down Tara, that they did not convert. That's actually in the annals. And the power of the Druids is such that, well, we all know the story of AD 60 when Suetonius Paulinus crossed the Menai Straits in Wales to massacre the last of the Welsh and British Druids in Anglesey. It makes you wonder what kind of power these Druids had, that at a time when Roman rule in Britain was basically going through an economic, social and political upheaval. This is the time of Boadicea, or Boudica, if you want to pronounce them, that they went to all the trouble of launching this significant military force to get a few Druids in an island off the coast of Wales. What kind of power do the Druids have? Now, this brings up the question, if the Druids, kept on going underground, which is very, very likely, after all the Gnostics did that, if the Druids kept existing as an underground force, are they still with us to this day? Well, it's a hard question to answer that, because there's the idea of the Druidic thing has become somewhat corrupted in recent centuries. Now, there was a revival in classical romanticism, neo-paganism, Druidic in Britain about 200 years ago. It was basically an offshoot of the artistic movement, the British Romantics, but it also crossed over into the Gothic movement as well. I mean, the British Gothic literature and artistic movement, the Gothic revival aspects of that. but mainly it was the Romantics. That's stemming out of the poetry of William Blake and groups such as artistic groups such as the Ancients, who were down there in Kent and with Mr. Palmer, Samuel Palmer, and they used to wander under the full moon through the fields of Kent, particularly at times of the harvest and during the summer months, to soak in the energy and the magic of the environment down there, the Garden of England. And this really gave birth to a revival in Druidry, which took off then again later in the later Victorian period. Now, this is not the same lineage of Druids extending back to the Druids of Tara or the Druids in Britain, the Druids like Merlin. It does not, they're not that lineage. They are a romantic revivalist outfit who started out with probably, well, they did by all accounts, quite beautiful and glorious aims to connect the aesthetic of man and the soul of man with that of the beauty of nature. There's nothing wrong with that, but unfortunately, because it would have been basically a middle class, upper middle class to lower aristocratic pursuit, it was always going to end up as a parlour game run by aristocrats. And this is why the Druidry we have today is completely shambolic. It's ridiculous. I mean, when you know that people like Winston Churchill was a major Druid, you know that that's not the Druidry of our ancestors. That's not the real Druidry. Now, at the end of the show, I'll talk about a possible war that's taking place between the real Druids, who we don't know who they are, and these fake Druids, which is manifesting in interesting ways, if it indeed is a war. We often hear about wars inside the power structure, secret wars inside Freemasonry, which I do actually believe exist. And you have more ridiculous ideas of this idea of the Illuminati still existing, the Bavarian Illuminati still existing, and these Egypts making up stories of ninjas and stuff, taking them down. But I do believe that, like any power system, whether it be in a theocratic power system, a political power system, economic power system, there's always the danger of coups, and there's always the danger of internal strife and internal civil wars. And this is one of the reasons why groups like Druidry were very secretive. Firstly, so they could not be found, and secondly, so they could keep their numbers small, that if a corruption happened, it would not spread like wildfire, the corruption, as what happened to Freemasonry after the Bavarian Illuminati entered the Grand Orient Lodge in Paris about 1790 and completely corrupted Freemasonry. Freemasonry became too much of an international idea, too much of a global brotherhood, and it was ripe for destruction from within. Now, the Druids were an oral tradition, and it's been shown time and time again that information is much more accurately stored when it's held as an oral repository, an oral tradition. It's the spoken word in terms of poems and satires and sonnets and prose and even songs. It's well known that the human mind memorizes lyrics and songs much better than they'd memorize a page of text. This is why advertisers, the black magicians of today, use jingles. In the past, that would have been sacred or profound knowledge or histories passed on through generation to generation through the oral bardic tradition. So there's no real good written accounts of what the Druids believed, and I'm glad there isn't. I mean, people often say to me, Thomas, what do we know about the Druids for a fact? And I'll say very, very little, except they existed and they scared the shit out of the Romans and the Greeks. Other than that, not a lot. And they'd say, isn't that, like people would say back to me, isn't that an awful, awful tragedy? And I would think to myself, well, is it an awful, awful tragedy? Is it? Because if they do still, it achieved their aims of the information not falling into the wrong hands. So they may have been, allegedly, or for all we know, wiped out by the Romans in AD 60, and then 400 or 500 years later by St. Patrick at Tara. But the fact that we don't really know an awful lot about their traditions and their beliefs shows that the system worked. The system was sound. Literally and figuratively, it was sound. The sound of the spoken word, the memorization, the idea of chanting. Now, we know that the Hindu Vedas, some of these go back 10,000 years, and they have been shown to be even more accurate than people suspected. Because you can tell when somebody's lying, but with their voice or by their facial language, through their facial cues, they're looking at arts, but you can't tell if somebody is lying in the written word, and that's why Roman law was written in stone. Now, it's written in stone as a kind of a psyop to make you think, well, it's totally inflexible. What the law is, but once it's written down, it ceases to exist, because it's no longer a subconscious cognitive experience within the mind and psychology of the person who's the repository. It then becomes an open manifesto. And then you have a society believing in the agenda and aims of the manifesto, while secretly the power structure ignores it. Classic example, the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights. What it does, it grants rights, but rights are inalienable, and it even says that, but rights are natural law. You cannot, no government or king or leader, whether it's the Magna Carta under King John or the American Constitution under their founding fathers, can grant you rights that nature has already provided. That's a given. But that's a black magic spell, because when those rights have been granted to you, what you have done is you've accepted your own acquiescence to the ones who granted you those rights, and therefore they can take them away. So the Druids, for all their what people think is the great tragedy in the belief that we lost everything, their system was sound and they carried it to the end. And if they still exist today, and I believe they do, they never went away, whatever they know will never be found on the internet. You will never find it typed up in a book. People say to me, what's the book we should read? There never will be a book. There never will be a book. People who pass this information on take an oath of debt not to reveal it. But not only that, it would not be given to anyone who did not rise to the level of expectation to be in charge of being a repository of that much information, or that powerful information. You don't go and do a course in becoming a druid, and then they say, oh, that's great, lads, here you go, now give me your ear and I'll whisper into it, and they whisper it doesn't work like that. It's like the shamans, these people who go on weekend shaman workshops in Glastonbury or Sedona, and then they think they're shaman. It's ridiculous. That's not how shaman or druids were picked. They were specific. Now, that doesn't mean we can't all have shamanic and druidic aspects in our lives, but I'm talking about the real guys. They had to go through rituals and rites to see if they were real deal. I know somebody a few years ago who converted to Judaism, and he was converting into a strict Orthodox form of Judaism, and they were doing things like tricking him and lying to him and calling him names and insulting him, just to see if he really wanted that, if he was converting for genuine religious reasons, or just doing it to look, I don't know, maybe he's mentally ill or something. But it'd be the same thing. So in Druidism, they would not have allowed anyone to be a Druid. It would have always been family. It would have always probably been males. And it would always have been people who were selected. Just because your dad was a Druid didn't mean you were going to become a Druid. You would have the right character and the right mental capacity and constitution to then go through an enormous amount of initiation and education. And then you may be given a part of the secret, not the entire thing, like a jigsaw piece. And the Druids as a whole, when they would meet in the grove, would come together and assemble their own part of the jigsaw into a greater understanding. And that's why these councils would have been called at times of urgency. They were probably in Wales. All the Druids were meeting in Wales. Suetonius Paulinus and the legionnaires were coming to formulate a plan for their own survival post-Roman imperial Europe. So it may seem on the surface romantic, but when you look at it, it's serious business. So therefore, these groups who call themselves neo-pagan Druids and the Society of Druids and all these other aristocratic parlour games are not the real thing. They're nearly all Freemasons. That's why so many of them are wearing a sash, and they're mocking the Druids who were slaughtered at places like Anglesey and in Tara. Now all you have to do is look at how these modern Druids go on their performances. I won't even call it a ritual or ceremony. It's a performance. The head or the archdruid walks at the front with an inverted sword clasped in his two hands and a sash around him, all dressed in white, followed by people dressed in white. This is a Christian Freemasonic ceremony. The sash makes that quite clear. It's often even orange, for God's sake. The sword he's holding is inverted with the handle just under his thorax, which is to show you that it's a crucifix. They're mocking real Druids. They're mocking them to show the real Druid, when the real Druids who are hidden in society, we don't know who they are, and when they switch on their TV and see these maggots, these aristocratic fruitcakes, walking around Stonehenge in their white robes, with a crucifix in front of them as in the guise of a sword, that's to let the real Druids know, look you bitches, we are in charge here. You are not. I can tell you for a fact that the real Druids probably dressed like anyone else. Think about it. They would not have wanted to bring attention to themselves. They would also be a dangerous thing to do. If they were to bring attention to themselves by wearing these nonsense white robes and so on, what would happen would be they would be captured and held as hostage and tortured. So they would not have been gone around going, hey guys, I'm a Druid, guys, check me out. No, that would not have happened. They would move among society just like anyone else. They would not go out of their way to have a flashing light over their head going, Druid, Druid, Druid. It would be known and understood by people who were around them who they were, but when they would travel outside their communities, remember, we didn't have a globalist community back then. You literally, your whole life could be spent in a few miles of where you live, and when you went outside there, no one knew who you were. If you were a Druid, your job was to stay low, keep your head down, move and get information, and pass on information to the ones that you felt could use it. Now, this corruption of Druidic rites is interesting in itself, because, well, let's look at Wicca. Wicca is an abomination. I want, my stomach turns when I see Wiccans at Stonehenge and Tara and places like that. That is not their lineage. Wicca is a modern 1950s basically game created for the wives of Freemasons so they could do something while their guys were down the lodge. And these Wiccans were invented by Gerald Gardner. I believe Crowley probably wrote a lot of the rites for the reason of keeping the morons out of Thelema, because Thelema being a very dangerous form of ritual magic. If you're in the wrong hands, it can kill. So Wiccans have no business being anywhere near these places, because that is not their heritage, with their pentagrams and all these other Middle Eastern symbols of Kabbalism that they bring to these islands that did not exist here. First of all. They have another aspect is the wand, and I want to talk about the relationship. See, these people have no deep relationship to the forest and to the woods. The true druids, the druids of antiquity, shall we say, they would have seen no distinction between the lives of people and the lives of trees. They would have seen trees in a very similar way. They would have not went down to the crystal shop and bought a cane wand. The wands that they would have had would have been specifically selected from special trees, just like the timbers in Vikings longships would have been selected from what they would call special trees, not just for their constructive abilities or maybe even their aesthetic, but for their energetic aspects. All trees have specific energies. In this part of the world, in Ireland, it seems to be that here they favoured the willow and the hazel. Now, that makes a lot of sense, particularly with the willow, because the willow is a very, very fast-growing tree. It grows very fast, and it can be used, its branches are used in many constructions. That's one of the reasons it was used for wicker houses, basket making, boat building, like the currachs they have here in Ireland, is because you could train and cut the willow in such a way that you could keep rejuvenating it. It grew so fast like bamboo. This would have been seen as something that had a very fast and high-moving charge. So therefore, a wand used in this part of the world, because of this wood grew fast here, they would have picked the fast-growing wood because it would have the best charge. Think about that. That speed of growth equals speed of energy, transmission of energy, and charge. The hazel was also commonly used, though not as quick growing. For other attributes, the hazel it produced food. It was also very abundant at one time. It was filled with animals. Wherever the hazel grew, it was a biosphere in itself, supporting a myriad of animals, from red squirrels, which are extinct now, nearly extinct, to all kinds of birds and all the other creatures who lived in and around the tree. That's energy too, because the hazel had its collective power. We also spoke last week about the apple. Now, apple wood is not particularly good for construction. It tends to split. It's hard to work with. But apple, again, the fruit that it bears, has always represented a transformative aspect. So therefore, the apple tree itself, maybe a small sprig of apple would be inserted into, this is why King Arthur went to Avalon, Welsh, Old Welsh for apple, into a hazel or a willow branch, almost as a kind of an upgrade of sorts. So it would have the energy of both the apple tree and of the willow tree or the hazel tree, or a combination of woods. Ideally, the yew tree is another one, and an interesting one is the yew tree. Now, the yew tree, for a long time, for about 1,000 years now, has been planted in graveyards, and this is very significant. Now, the yew is also regional species. There's types of yews. Like in Perthshire in Scotland, they have a particular type of yew that they have. In Ireland, the yew looks quite different. And in England, the yew is different. There's subspecies. They're almost a tree with, now the same species, but they're a tree with a real personality. And the personality is almost kind of feminine. Just about every part of the yew tree, with the exception of the fruit, is poisonous to humans. And even inside the fruit, the berry is poisonous. But yet the yew tree, because of this ability to kill a human being, its energetic power is seen as a communicative conduit between this world and the next world. For example, because the yew can kill you, it can also be seen as a way to transform you to the other world, which I've spoke about in previous shows. This is why the yew tree is often planted in cemeteries in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales and France. Traditionally, it has a complex and massive root system below the ground, which is identical to the growth of the tree above the ground. So it's of this reality, but also of the other world below the ground. Now, a couple of years ago in England, and I think it was on the Norfolk coast, in a place called Home next to the sea, a remarkable thing called sea henge was discovered. It was a timber circle, and in the centre was a tree that had been buried face down and roots up. Almost as a gift or an offering to the other world, but also the other world's gift and offering to us. Very, very significant, this tree at Seahenge. Now, when this thing came up out of the ground and was found, it immediately, there was an enormous amount of controversy about it. Who owns it? Who, when it was discovered in the late 90s, who owns it? The neo-pagans are desecrating our site. And I knew this was significant because of the hubbub it would cause. And the same old, Freemasonic Druids tried to grab hold of the project and tried to say it was theirs. Why? And they're desecrating their place. No. Their roots are not the real Druidism. Their roots are Victorian parlour games. I think that they were afraid of something. I think that they saw that as a sign of the real Druids making a comeback. And the neo-pagan society of Druids were terrified. Something was happening. Now, before I get to this war within Druidry, they see these things as very substantial, because imagine if somebody was playing with toy guns and practicing with toy guns, and then someone with a real gun came in. The toy guns that go bang, 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 and don't actually shoot, have no power, but the real gun does. So you have these plastic fake Druids dressed in their white nun-like robes with that solemn, obnoxious Christian mannerism of theirs, walking around praying to some gods, in their case Jehovah, playing the Druid, and then suddenly the Seahenge place washes up. The Seahenge appears and shows us a tree in reverse. Now imagine if there were such things as real Druids, the real ones going right back to the ancients, our ancient ancestors, who are hiding as a secret society, not prancing around Stonehenge like the Society of Druids, these people like William Roach and from Coronation Street and Winston Churchill, the real ones. This would be seen as a very, very significant event. This would have been seen as a supernatural event, and they would have seen this as, shall we say, a flare gun being fired off. This is probably why the neo-pagans who have no roots with this Seahenge place immediately tried to cover it up, hoard it off as their own little sacred place and keep the public away from it. Almost as if they wanted to bury it, kill it, or destroy it. ASAP. Was Seahenge the moment when the war was on? You look through history at certain people who seemed incredibly enlightened, and you wonder to yourself, were they the real Druids? Someone like Carl Jung. someone like Joseph Campbell. Were these guys the real Druids? Someone like James Joyce. Were these guys the real Druids? Were they the real thing? And were these people moving in the arts, moving in business, moving in everything, hiding under the surface, knowing that the day would have to come when these fake Druids was taken down? Now you remember I spoke about the Yew Tree and the significance of the Yew Tree. Well, that brings us to Operation Yewtree. Myself and some others are speculating that Operation Yewtree may be a manifestation in the public view of this war between the fake the fake Druids and the real Druids. Before I get to that, I want to talk about what happened this year at Stonehenge. Now, I've seen it's made all the major headlines and it's made a lot of news, and this has never happened before. But 23,000 hippies, New Agers, and of course self-styled Druids. And that's what I found very interesting, that the stories in the paper and even people who took photographs of the aftermath of this summer solstice event this year in Stonehenge used the term self-styled Druids. And they showed Stonehenge looking desecrated. It was covered in litter, garbage, beer bottles, all the other middle-class paraphernalia, the remains of Guardian newspapers, and all those other things that attract these types, these fakes. And the place looked disgusting and filthy. And people went, oh, it's disgusting. And then the first thing I said to myself, why this year? Why now? Why now? Well, it's easy. Suppose you are a real Druid in a position of power. You would organise it deliberately so Stonehenge gets trashed in order to stop these self-styled Druids and these other New Age ponces from getting near Stonehenge and other sites during the solstice. Now you'll have all the fakes going, oh, it's the police state, they're going to stop the spiritual people from going there. No, maybe they're just trying to get the Druids out of there. It's almost like a counter-insurgency measure, or should I say an insurgency measure. I deliberately tarnished the name, because every story I've read in the newspapers about this vandalism at Stonehenge, every single one of them has mocked or made fun of these self-styled Druids. And these are the terms they use, self-styled or modern Druids. Somebody somewhere is pulling the strings somewhere to take Druidry, this modern Druidry down. Now, in Operation Yewtree, of all the names they could have picked, to bring these celebrities down, they pick Operation Yewtree. And everyone they've taken down has been, from what I can tell, a Freemason. And certainly in the case of William Roach, a Druid, well up there of these modern Druids, these self-styled Druids. Now Savile is an interesting one too. It is almost, again, look at the timeline. Stonehenge appeared in 1998. Things started to change after that. Now I think that in Rolf Harris's case, I think he was a Freemason. I think he was stitched up. He's different. I'll put him to one side. But the rest of them definitely have that smell about them. William Roach and his Lodge brothers are the real Druids making a move. Behind the scenes, in positions of power, both with Operation Yewtree and this high-profile, very, very well-publicised vandalism of Stonehenge, Are they in the process of demolishing William Roach and his fake neo-pagan self-styled Druids? Are they coming back? Well, I don't know. I can only read the signs, and I'd be very interested to know, and I can't find any info on it, if the tree at Seahenge was a yew tree. If the tree that was inverted upside down was a yew tree. I know it's romantically tempting to think that there are groups who hide in secret, get into positions of power, and have the best interests of their community at heart. Now, if they were Druids in this part of the world, they wouldn't be worried about Africans, they wouldn't be worried about Chinamen, they wouldn't be worried about anyone else, because that's not their tribe. They would specifically be concerned with their own tribe. And now unprecedented things have happened in recent times. We now have the concept of a British minister, an MP, who murdered a 14-year-old boy at a sex party. How is this stuff getting out? Who's leaking it? The man, I think his name Lord Canning, the guy that's too senile to stand trials, coming out now that he raped and tortured boys in Westminster. How is this stuff coming out? Who is making the move? Who is doing the leaks? And who is getting this stuff out there? So it's always very tempting to think, and very romantic and very reassuring to think, that on the inside there are Druids or other secret organizations who have the tribe, now don't say humanity, say the tribe, whatever tribe you're in, best interest at heart. And they are secretly and low-key, remember what I said about the Druids in the past? They didn't ponce around England and Ireland, Scotland and Wales in white robes, waving a wand and putting a laurel wreath on their head. They didn't ponce around going, where are the Druids? They would have not looked like Gandalf, as romantic as the idea of Gandalf is. They would have, you wouldn't have known them. They would have been more close to Tom Bombadil in the Tolkien stories. They would have been the figure that appeared in a community at a time of trouble and saved them. I often wonder if someone like William Wallace was a Druid. If William Wallace's arrival, and particularly his execution, which is horrific, he was castrated slowly in London. And in fact they took him down to London. This was an energetic transfer. This was the hammer of the Scots. Took him down to London, castrated him, removed his entrails while he was still alive, cooked them in front of him, then strangled him, quartered him in 4 halves, and sent a piece of him to England, a piece of him to Scotland, a piece of him to Wales, and a piece of him to Ireland, as a warning. But this was not just propaganda and brutality. This was also black magic. That's the purpose of that. That's why they brought him to London, to charge Babylon, Londonium, Babylondon, with this energy. Because when they castrated him, it was saying to the Scots, we're castrating the Scots. But something remarkable then happens. Even though he's dead, that he could have been planning, if he was a Druid, that ritual in of himself. This would explain why he was suddenly very well thought of by the Scottish power structure. And then the Scots win their independence in an incredible victory against the English at Bannockburn, when a small Scottish army was heavily outnumbered by the English, wins a colossal victory, and nobody can understand how. Now there's all kinds of romantic tales, which I don't believe for 1 minute, that the Knights Templar showed up at the last moment to save Scotland. The Knights Templars would never in a million years be loyal to Scotland. They're loyal to the Vatican. They're loyal to themselves. They're loyal to the kings who paid them. They would not be loyal to Scotland. And they did not show up in the battle. They're just stories. The Scots at Bannockburn had magic and powers that were extraordinary and allowed them to defeat a much larger English army. Did William Wallace give himself up knowing that his horrific death would charge the weapons of the Scottish? There was no big deal made about his sword and all this kind of thing. Were there other people like that? Remember, it's about the tribe. It's not about humanity as a whole. Although that's going to piss off the hippies, it's about the tribe. So any work done on behalf of Druids in secret will be done in the best interest of their own tribe, not in the interest of humanity. I know that's another psyop. We all have to serve humanity. We can't. Not all of us can. It's impossible for one person to serve humanity. We can only serve ourselves and our local community. That's a kind of a proto-globalist idea. Especially in those days, you could only serve the tribe. So, are real Druids working behind the scenes to demolish the British establishment? Well, it certainly seems like there's somebody behind the scenes doing it. Who's really behind Operation Yew Tree? Who is really behind blowing the lid on all these pedo scandals with these politicians? Who's really involved in what's happening at Stonehenge? Who ordered the arrest of William Roach? Who really is pushing the stuff out there about Savile? And why am I getting all kinds of information and contacts given to me out of the blue by people I don't know that's been very useful in my own investigation into Jimmy Savile? What's going on? There are people on my Facebook page that are very interesting characters, but I don't really know who they are, but they've been very useful in feeding me ideas and information. And this is how Druids did exist today. This is how they would exist. This is how they would work. If they saw social injustice somewhere in their tribe, well, they would go and infiltrate and offer advice and help. They wouldn't stand on the stage. You wouldn't know who their names were, but they would get close enough and move in among the protesters, among the people looking for their civil rights, the insurgents, offer advice, drop hints, maybe get dirt on the people that are oppressing them. This is how they would function. This is how Druids would function today. And yes, they would be involved very much in magic. Very much. Now, they wouldn't be waving wands. They wouldn't be doing those kinds of things. They'd be involved in things like movies. If the Druids are out there today, they're making films. They're involved in the arts. And they use the arts, and they would be using things like YouTube like you wouldn't believe. They would be using things, and in such a roundabout way that wouldn't be aimed at you and the alternative media per se, but would be aimed at the population at large to trigger a consciousness shift. It's happened before. There's always been a TV documentary or an artwork or a story that basically stopped the worst of the worst from happening. Let's look at the Cold War. People of a certain generation born in the 50s and 60s lived in fear, and even the ones born in the 40s, of being annihilated in a nuclear war. You had filmmakers and other people making science fiction dramas and other things that portrayed in a very terrifying but humanistic way what the world would be like if these madmen in charge actually got their way and had their little nuclear war. And I'm thinking about films like When the Wind Blows. Who was behind that? Who financed those kind of films? Who was behind films like The Handmaid's Tale? Who was George Orwell really? Who was he working for? We always hear about everything else. Illuminati, 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 Freemasons. Look, people are blue in the face. But no one ever stops and thinks, are these people actually being advised by unknown powerful druids that are actually the ones who are actually giving them the impetus, the funding, the ideas, the voice, the platform? See, the druid would not stand on the platform. The druid would not stand in marble arch on top of the soapbox, but the druid would make sure that a very specifically sturdy and taller soapbox was handed to the people, that was pushed under the feet of the people who they believed had the best message or the best interest of the tribe at hand. So we have this sea henge thing appears in 1998 off the coast of Norfolk. This was the impetus, this was the signal, this was the starting gun for the hidden druids who probably don't even know each other, very loose connections, but they're trained to look for signs. And that tree buried upside down, and ever since then, hasn't things been interesting? Haven't we seen the British establishment fall apart? Now, another thing that I find very, very interesting was, and this was absolutely a ritual, do you remember last year, a couple of years ago, the horsemeat scandal? They were finding horsemeat in Findus lasagna. And I was watching this story and I said something kind of interesting is going to happen with this. And nothing happened for a long time. It was just seemed like a food scandal until bingo, it popped up there. Princess Anne, the Queen's eldest daughter, I think her only daughter perhaps, said that Britons should get used to eating horsemeat. Eating horsemeat. Right there and then, I knew what was going on. Some of you might find this story disgusting, but this is my ancestors' history. How Irish kings were crowned in the past was the Druids would find the king. And the king in the previous generations, these were kings that used to fight to get to the top. These were kings who used to go to war. They were not born into bloodlines, but they were specially chosen kings for having certain powers. But they had the most bizarre coronation ceremony of the Irish kings. This has been right up to the time of St. Patrick, maybe even later. The Irish king would be brought to a tree, a specifically special tree. On that tree would be a horse that had been tied there by a druid. The king would declare himself an animal or a beast, no longer a human, and he would have intercourse with the horse. When he was finished copulating with the horse was killed, and then its blood and its meat put into a pot, made into a stew, and then that stew was fed to the population. And that meant that then the coronation was complete. So we had Princess Anne saying that maybe Britons need to get used to eating horsemeat, and millions of them, and Irish people, had it happen to them clandestine by when horsemeat was leaked into popular quote-unquote beef products, to the point where anything sold with mincemeat in it for about 6 months had so much horsemeat in it. There was no such thing as pure meat unless you killed the horse, you killed the cow yourself and butchered it yourself. We were all those of us who eat cow meat a few years ago were all eating and consuming unknown. Whether we had a burger in a restaurant, bought mincemeat in the shops, or bought lasagna, we were all eating horsemeat. And then Princess Anne, on behalf of the Saxe-Gotha-Coburg dynasty, makes that statement. You tell me that was not a strange coincidence. They can't pass those things off today. But a Druidic king in Buckingham Palace, or a Druidic royalty, these people are incredibly superstitious, but they could also be terrified of the power of the real Druids. And it could be a sense of panic, and they tried everything, including an ancient Druidic Irish coronation ceremony of the king having sex with the horse and us all eating horse meat. It happened. Is it a coincidence? I don't know. Maybe it is. It just seems incredibly fucked up to me. Of all the people, excuse me, of all the people to go out there in public and say, what's wrong with eating horse meat? It shouldn't be so bad, was a senior member of the British royal family. Knowing what we know about how ancient Druidic kings were coronated. We were all, that horse meat scandal was a ritual. Only fools and horses. That's what we were. We were only the fools that were led to eat horses and take part in some reenactment, possibly in a state of terror, as the British establishment falls apart behind the scenes, in some kind of weird, their own kind of weird reenactment of a Druidic coronation in order to somehow desperately try to cling on to power. I truly believe that the Druids survived. I truly believe that they have hidden and worked for the better of their tribe, not the human race, for their tribe, behind the scenes. Was Michael Collins one here in Ireland? Well, he certainly seems to have been an interesting guy who came from a very interesting family. Was George Orwell one? Maybe. Was William Wallace one? Maybe. But there's definitely, if they weren't Druids, there have been Druids there in the background, guiding them and looking after them. Remember, Churchill was a big-time neo-modern, neo-pagan, Victorian fake Druid. There were meetings that him and Michael Collins had in Westminster during the Anglo-Irish talks in the 1920s that it sounded like, when you read the text of what would happen, it sounded like two Druids. It sounded like Saruman and Gandalf having a summit. Was he one? Who knows? But they were doing it for the tribe. Not doing it for humanity, but for the tribe. Operation Yew Tree, Stonehenge, the horse meat rituals. And now this year, the summer solstice, which I have to say found very interesting this year. There was a very strong cleansing effect to this solstice this year. Yeah, as you know me, I believe that something happened in 2008. It changed, the shift in consciousness and perception. And this seems to have almost brought to an end of that state. Now, 2008 was exactly 8 years after, a decade after Stonehenge was found. I believe there's a huge mystery for all of us to look in there, and I hope many of you will look at this too. Will look at this and start to see there's something been going on, and not just Operation Yewtree, and not just the horse meat ritual, but have these fuckers, these terrified neo-pagan Victorian parlour game druids, been trying to desperately do things to stay in power. Are there other signs? Are there other signs of the old druids taking them on, other than things like what we found out of Savile, other than things that was done to William Roach from Coronation Street and Operating Yew Tree, other than those things? Is their backs to the wall, and are the snakes really coming back? The same snakes that St. Patrick banished from Ireland, are they back? Are they coming back behind the scenes? We'll never know for sure, because they will never have a taking down of the power structure and then stand there at a press conference saying, we are the noble druids who returned from our hiding place They will just go back into the world of business, academia, education, and all these other things. And they will just go out there and their job will be done. They will not make a song and dance about it, because that would be a sacrilege to them. So anyway, think that one over, and maybe we'll continue this again in a later show. I believe I've only scratched the surface here of a potential war between the real Druids and the Victorian aristocrat parlour game neo-pagan Druids. I think we're living in an amazing time to watch these things, because we have the ability to decipher and detect them. This could be so deep, guys. This could tie into everything, to why London is starting to look more and more like some kind of like transhumanist gothic skyscraper city. This could tie into so many things, so many deep things. Why Irish water, Ishkabaha, the water of life, the sacred well of the Irish Druids, has been stolen by a corporation and removed from the people. We could be looking at something really deep here, really powerful, and really beneficial to each one of us as individuals, if we can detect these things and learn to read the news with our Druidic sensors open. Thank you very much. I'll see you all next week. ThomasSheridanArts.com is my website. My YouTube channel is Thomas Sheridan Arts, which I've been doing a lot more uploading on there. And I will talk to you all this time next week. Take care, and fuck 'em if they can't take a joke.